Before we get into this first of 3 videos on the urinary system, I'd like to draw your attention to the word right down there in red, uppercase letters, subscribe. Please subscribe. The more subscribers I get, the more I'm encouraged to keep going with these videos, and I hope you learn something from them. Let's get going. The urinary system is really part of a larger system. We think about the excretory system, and the urinary system is part of the excretory system. I just have to draw your attention to a couple of things here. Excretion, by definition, is getting rid of metabolic wastes. Our body, in its cell metabolism, produces a number of wastes. We have carbon dioxide, which we get rid of when we exhale. We produce ammonia, which we get rid of through the urinary system. We have water, which is a metabolic waste, although there's some discussion, I suppose, as to whether water is an excretion or a secretion. So let's just focus in on a couple of those things. Excretion, getting rid of metabolic wastes. It happens through our lungs, through our skin, with water. Also a little bit of urea is excreted through our skin. Sweat contains a small amount of urea. And getting rid of metabolic waste, nitrogenous waste through the urinary system. There's a difference also between excretion and secretion. Secretion is when your cells release substances which are useful to the body. The things we're talking about here are no longer useful. They are waste products, so they have to be excreted. And one other fine point before we get into this, there is one other excretory product that is actually excreted through the digestive system. If you think back to the liver function, the liver produces bilirubin and biliverdin from the destruction of dead red blood cells. Those 2 proteins are put into the digestive system, and feces contains those. They are metabolic waste, but that's the easiest way for the body to get rid of those things. So in this particular series, we're looking only at getting rid of nitrogenous wastes, the urinary system. I pre-drew this because it's a little bit more difficult to try and draw it quickly, but I want to draw your attention to the parts of it and make sure you understand what's connected to what. The red blood vessel here is the aorta. In this part of the body where it's running down the back, we call it the dorsal aorta. Now if you look at it, it comes down. There's a branch here, as well as on the other side. That's a branch of the aorta. That's an artery, of course. This is the renal artery, which takes the blood into the kidney. Now this kidney here is going to be the left kidney. Right kidney's on that side. Not all the blood goes into the kidneys. The blood continues to go on down, and you notice that the aorta branches. This is the iliac artery. So we have an iliac artery that takes blood down into the legs. Of course, branches of that are known as the femoral arteries and so on. The blood vessel on the other side is the vena cava. This is going to be the inferior vena cava. Although some people call it the posterior vena cava, it's the same thing. We have blood vessels which come out of kidneys. This is the right kidney here. As you see, this one there is going to be the renal vein. And of course we have the blood vessel that goes down from the legs, bringing blood back up. We have the iliac vein. So let's just check the route of blood flow here. Out of the left ventricle, down the aorta, blood will go into the kidney. It'll come out of the kidney and it'll go back up to the right atrium of the heart in the Vena Cava on both sides. Not all the blood does that at the same time. Of course, some keeps on going down to the legs and so on. As with the circulatory system, it stands to reason that in between the arterial blood vessels here and the venual blood vessels, there has to be a capillary bed. This capillary bed is very, very complicated. It's not like just the blood comes in and blood pressure forces plasma-like fluid out into tissue spaces and it's drawn back in again. This process is much more complicated because you see there's the relationship it has with the kidney. The kidney itself, if you look, I'll put the word here, there's a tube coming out of the kidney. That tube is the ureter. The urinary bladder is here. And the urethra. Just if you ever have any confusion as to which order these tubes go in, they're in alphabetical order. Not that that's the way they were named, but that the ureter alphabetically is before urethra, and the urine flows through it first. So now what we have, if we just go back and think about it again, the blood comes down, goes into the kidneys, there's the capillary bed here, blood comes back out, but at the same time, we've produced urine. And the urine flows down here to the bladder where it gets stored, and eventually it's released to the outside of the body. This process, and I'm going to put a great big F here, this process that goes on in the kidneys is a filtration process. The kidneys actually filter out wastes, metabolic waste, nitrogenous wastes from the body, from the blood, allows the blood to go back to the heart, and the waste material, which is the urine, comes down here. It's very complicated, and that's what we have to look at in this topic. Now let's examine what these nitrogenous wastes are in the first place. These things that the kidneys have to get rid of. Our cells make ammonia. Ammonia is toxic. It's very toxic. It enters blood in capillary beds. If it stayed in the blood and didn't get converted into anything else, it wouldn't take very long until your blood was too toxic and you wouldn't survive. The liver, one of the functions of the liver, if you remember, is to convert NH3, the ammonia, into urea. Urea, again, is a nitrogenous waste. Nitrogenous waste, NH3, NH3. Urea is like this. It's less toxic. What it is, quite simply, is two ammonia groups have dropped a hydrogen and the carbon picks up an oxygen, so it's actually transporting us twice as much in a less toxic form. So this is an easier way for the stuff to get transported around our body. This, although it's less toxic, still has to get removed from the body. And what happens, quite simply, is that the kidneys remove the urea from blood. So there's the steps that we go through in the production of urea. The material that's released here is called urine, and urine is rich in urea. There's the connection. There's another product that cells make that we have to mention as well. Cells also make uric acid. Now, uric acid is another nitrogen-containing compound. It makes it from the metabolism of purines. Purines. Purines are those nitrogenous bases like adenine and guanine that are parts of nucleic acids. So when we metabolize nucleic acids, sometimes there's purines, which are products that you have to get rid of. Each purine molecule has actually got 5 nitrogens in it, so it's another way to get rid of some nitrogen, which we really don't need. So let's just back up a little bit. We know that the blood's going to come in. We know that these materials are going to get filtered out. The pure uric acid is also filtered out in here. So uric acid and urea will enter into the ureter, stored in the urinary bladder, and leave the body through the urethra. Now, just before we get into the details of what the kidney looks like inside, I do have to mention that it's not a free-flowing down here. It's not like this is gravity-fed. This tube is normally closed, and peristalsis, remember the peristalsis, where you have the combined action of longitudinal and circular muscles, peristalsis forces the fluid down into the urinary bladder. And while we're talking about muscles, there are actually 2 sphincter muscles along the urethra. One of them is at the base of the bladder, actually, where the urethra starts. The other one's not very far from that one, but these are normally closed and they have to relax in order to allow urination, which is getting rid of the urine. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at what the inside of a kidney actually looks like. I'm going to leave that there because I can use it again. Let's use this kidney here and represent it like this. There's the urinary part of the structures itself. The renal artery brings blood in to the kidney. The renal vein is going to take the blood out of the kidney. And the filtration process that I alluded to occurs in the kidney itself. This stubby end right here, this is the ureter, remember? And it's a muscular tube, and the peristaltic activity forces the urine down. So obviously this space here, this is the hollow tube, the lumen of this tube is continuous with, down here, the bladder and the urethra. This is outside the body here. This is outside the body here. This, the interior of this tube, is technically speaking outside the body, because the component, the material that would travel through this tube is continuous with the outside of the body. The blood in the blood vessels is inside of the body. So somewhere in here, there's an exchange between tissues which allows the waste materials to get out of the body, technically out of the body, because they've crossed the membrane, they're inside the kidneys and travel down the ureter. I liken this system in this regard, I liken it to quite a bit to the respiratory system and the alveoli. Remember, there's millions of alveoli in the lungs, and the air that's in the alveoli technically is still outside of the body because it's continuous with the outside. And you breathe, it goes in and out and in and out. This system is similar in some regards because the material inside the tubes that are at the top of the ureter inside the kidney is technically outside the body. And the exchange between blood and those tubes occurs in here. This ureter, although this is a hollow space now, remember, this leads to a space which is inside the kidney here. And I'll draw it like that. This space here is called the pelvis. the renal pelvis. Obviously, renal is a term that refers to kidneys. And this then is the tissue of the kidney. This ureter, this is a hollow space, this is a space. The renal pelvis it stores urine until it can go down the ureter. And remember, the movement of the material down the ureter is by peristalsis, so it has to engage in muscle activity to get it down here. So this area up here produces the urine, it gets stored here, and then it gets slowly moved down to the bladder. The tissue of the kidney itself has got two parts. So let me go back and put a dotted line here, or a dashed line like that. The outer part here is called the cortex, renal cortex or kidney cortex. Cortex, of course, is just that word that means the outer part of an organ. And here, again, we've seen this term before, the renal medulla. Remember, medulla is a term that means the inner part of an organ. Now there's one more thing I can represent on here, and that's where all this happens. This renal artery comes in, brings blood in, and it forms a capillary bed. So it branches, and 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 forms a capillary bed, not in the pelvis, remember there's a hollow space, but out into the cortical region. And the other side of the capillary bed is made up of the venous side, which is here, and the branches from here come out like that. The filtration process occurs where these capillaries are. And let me show you the kind of structure that is required for that, because the filtration process has to be such that we get the filtrate, the material, down to here. It go back to even thinking of a filter. Stuff comes in, you could take the stuff out, like the arterial blood would come in. You could get the venual blood out, but you also get material that comes through the filtering process, and this stuff is called a filtrate. So we have to get the filtrate to come down into the renal pelvis. The filtrate in this case is the urine. And what happens quite simply, and I didn't draw it before, this tissue here is not just an irregularly shaped tissue. This has branches of tubes that extend all through here. And at the top of these branches are the filtering devices themselves. Each one of these little tubes is called a nephron. And nephrons are really, that's the topic that is in the second video in this series. That's how we actually make the urine. That process is fairly complicated and deserves an entire video of its own. But before we do that, let me represent one complete nephron. I'll use this here. A nephron, I'll use this. It doesn't matter because there's millions of them. A nephron could look like this. Notice the filtration thing. And then the filtrate could go down into the renal pelvis. Notice the squiggly nature of this tube. It's got a cup-shaped structure, a squiggly in the long part and a squiggly part. Notice one more thing, and this will become important in the second video in the series, that in total, this structure makes 3 passes through the medulla here. It goes from cortex to medulla, from medulla to cortex, from cortex back to medulla. That's a very important component of the story. So there you have it. I think we're all set up for the topic of how the kidney actually makes urine, and we'll have to get into this business of a nephron. Let me put down the word nephron for us so that the second video will actually pick up with nephron structure. But that's a nephron, that's the key to the whole process. Thank you very much, and if you've enjoyed this first look at the urinary system, like I say, don't forget to subscribe.